Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. And today we have for you a special prize, a special episode, which is another Free Kiwis dialogue, where it's just Michael and I. And we're recording this the day after the long-awaited Victoria University of Wellington free speech panel, or actually a couple of panels, or we should call it maybe a free speech event. And one of the speakers was Michael. And so we just wanted to sort of talk about that and have a kind of debrief and discuss what we thought of it. So, yeah, Michael, maybe I'll just get your sort of very quick impression of the event.
Well, probably the best way to summarize it is that it was a clown show. It was not a discussion. It was a series of questions asked. Well, actually, the first panel was a series of short talks which were completely disconnected. There was no interaction between the speakers at all. And the second panel, which was supposed to be an academic discussion about the role of universities in supporting free speech, was neither an academic discussion nor about the role of universities in supporting free speech. What it was largely a group of activists making points about their identity groups, and it had no academic depth at all. The moderator was a journalist, Corinne Dan, who actually asked questions and steered the whole discussion away from the topic that the Vice-Chancellor Nick Smith had set for the conversation. There was no ability of the panelists to interact and to have anything like a conversation, let alone an academic one. I would say there was very little expertise on the panel about the issue at hand. There was certainly none in the moderator. I would say that he was completely ill-equipped and hadn't actually even taken notice of the discussion he was supposed to be leading. So it was a farce.
Yeah, okay. I mean, strong words, but I have to say, my own reactions were kind of similar. I was at the same time really depressed and quite happy. It was a weird reaction, but I'll explain. So I was incredibly depressed. At certain moments, I felt very dark. It was a very dark moment because I grew up in Canada and the UK, and I've lived in the States and also here. And I always thought that the English-speaking countries were the kind of forefront of liberalism. This belief that people should be free in society, especially you should be able to say what you think, and that this is actually a fundamental thing not only for liberalism but also for democracy. And sitting there last night, I just thought, what country am I in? What society is this where you have these panels of academics? Okay, some of them are sort of more activist than academics, but they have university jobs, and they just seem to either completely misunderstand free speech or really not like it, especially if it's free speech of people that they disagree with or that they see as kind of lower class. They wouldn't put it in those terms, but that's effectively what's...
One of the panelists fairly much declared her enmity towards free speech by saying that it was a colonialist concept and really implied that it had no place in a bicultural Aotearoa.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting, actually, that point, because I heard language like that from the TEU in the past. I think there's an article where Sandra Gray describes free speech as a Pākehā construction.
Yeah.
But now I think that the TEU, from what we heard from Sandra Gray at our recent symposium, has shifted to this other position, which I think the higher-ups at the university have shifted to as well, which is, no, we like free speech because, of course, the new government's come in with a mandate from the people, basically saying we need to sort out the universities. And suddenly they're kind of like, oh, yeah, well, no, we like free speech. But then the dodge here, I think, in this next phase of the debate is going to be, we love free speech. We think that everyone should be able to say whatever they want as long as it's what we agree with. Right?
We need to restrict free speech in order to protect free speech.
That's what we heard, both of those tropes during this debate. So hold on. So that's the thing I was depressed by. And then why was I happy? I was I was depressed, but I was weirdly happy as well because I thought, yes, they're revealing what they really think, and it's beautiful how clear it will be to people. I think taxpayers around the country, how biased they are and how much they dislike free speech and how little they understand free speech. And to me also the sort of contempt that they hold towards people who are actually paying their salaries.
And the utter lack of self-awareness with which they promulgated this. One of the subtexts to the whole I won't call it a conversation, to the whole event, was these activist academics and just plain activists being self-congratulatory about how open universities really are and how there isn't a crisis of free speech or any real problems with free speech on campuses. And that's setting aside the fact that nobody, I would say with the exception of Jonathan Ailing and myself, tried to discuss really free speech more broadly, because the whole thing was narrowly focused not just on who should be allowed to speak on campuses, but with this very identitarian lens.
Yeah.
About the harm that can be caused by what people might say.
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues there, but I guess I was happy that free speech was sort of proving its kind of revelatory capacities. I mean, this is one of the arguments for free speech. Even if you disagree with what people are saying, it's a good idea to let them say it, partly because it just gives people more information about what's going on. And I think we've tried for a long time to kind of get out to people what's going on within New Zealand universities, and particularly Victoria University. And I thought, like last night, they're doing it for us. It's beautiful. If we set up an event, we like paid people to actually show what's going on in universities, we couldn't have done a better job. Right?
That's true. And that's where their lack of self-reflection and self-awareness does us a favour, because they didn't see any irony in simultaneously claiming to be speaking in good faith and actually showing that they had no concept whatsoever of what academic freedom is, let alone free speech more generally.
Yeah, and I think another big issue the whole night was just institutional neutrality and lack of political bias. Like, it's meant to be a neutral institution. That doesn't mean, of course, that they can't come to conclusions that the right is going to like more or the left is going to like more. But of course, as you and I know, it's almost always you come to conclusions that the left is going to like more. And if someone comes to a conclusion that the right likes more, they're going to be in trouble, right? So nine times out of 10. And I think, again, that they really beautifully kind of showed their hand there. I mean, I think Jane Kelsey, right at the end of the event, she was saying something like, we need to have free speech so that, the ACT policy on the Treaty of Waitangi, we can dismantle that with students. And that's the only reason, she said something as strong as this, the only reason we should discuss an ACT policy is in order to dismantle it. Yes. Now, I mean, I don't care what people think about that particular ACT policy. It may be that ACT policy is terrible and it deserves to be dismantled in class, if the conversation goes that way. But it's just interesting to me that it's always going to be the ACT policy, right, in the contemporary New Zealand university.
Yeah, well, one wonders what would happen if a student in that class had the temerity to support the ACT policy and point out some of the problems that they're perceiving with students' ability to discuss things and how their peers kind of belittle them if they put forward a view that's contrary to the dominant narrative.
And anyway. now we know the answer to that, right? Because Kelsey just said it straight out. Like she said, the only reason that we should discuss an ACT policy is in order to dismantle it. So if a student in the class wanted to make a positive point defending that ACT policy, they have to be shut down, right? Because there's no other reason to discuss an ACT policy except to dismantle it.
Yes.
So, I mean, and you have to remember, I mean, for people who are sort of at Victoria University and have the misfortune of still being in that bubble, there are some facts you need to bear in mind, like the country of New Zealand is bigger than the Kelburn campus of Victoria University of Wellington. We just had an election of which, what percentage of the vote did ACT get? Something like 10%, right?
8 and a bit, I think.
Right, so but like a substantial number of people voted for ACT. ACT is now in government because it reflects the level of support they had. There is a centre-right government in power at the moment. Doesn't mean they can do whatever they want, but it's an MMP system, right? It's a proportional representation system. It reflects quite accurately what people actually think in the society. And the people in this society are paying for universities.
But clearly the majority of academics feel that the people got it grievously wrong at the election and really need to be corrected rather than have their will enacted.
I mean, it's like, obviously on discrete issues, I mean, it's not the case that the government should just be able to kind of shut academics down. There shouldn't be a tyranny of the majority.
Of course not.
But what we're saying is just that they need to have some minimal level of neutrality and respect because they're meant to serve all of New Zealanders. So there are going to be people in your class, even if there aren't any among your colleagues because of all the discrimination against people to the right of centre in academia. But there are going to be people in the community who are right-wing. And you have to actually serve them rather than shut them down. And
maybe it's worth just reflecting on what a good class on this topic might look like. It might be to say, well, one of the many issues discussed at the election was whether there is a problem on university campuses with the ability for people to speak freely. Clearly, some people think there is. Perhaps we could have an open discussion, and all points of view are welcome on whether you personally have discovered anything along those lines. What does the evidence, such as it is, tell us? There are some surveys out there. Are they good surveys? Are they not so good surveys? What do they tell us, if anything? What are some of the incidents that have occurred? Do they constitute a violation of academic freedom? What about free speech more generally? And have an open discussion like that, and then look at the ACT policy and say, do we think that this, if there is a problem, is this the right intervention, or would there be a better way? Something like that, rather than, as you say, just, this is a terrible policy, let's dismantle it.
Yeah, and I think that some of the panelists did actually start to say, they tried to say that in their classes they do actually have debates and they try and be fair-minded, and that's obviously a good sign, and we should take note of that. However, I thought that, I actually sort of felt some pity for them, because I thought that in the act of saying, no, we're being very neutral and level-headed and even-handed, they actually kind of, again, let spill like how biased they are, almost like without realizing it. Like, I think it's a genuine blind spot in some cases. Yeah, like I think, was it Lyndon Johnson who said something like, oh no, we debate things in class all the time. Like we debate, for example, the nature of power in society and how it affects minorities, right?
Yes.
So it's kind of like, she thinks she's being even-handed, but because she lives in this bubble, she doesn't realize that like that very way of looking at society in terms of power and minorities, as opposed to something else like markets or whatever, or virtue or whatever some kind of strong conservative might say, that is in itself like quite a bias.
It reminds me actually of something that happened when I was Associate Dean in the Education Faculty at Victoria University. One of my tasks was to look over the course outlines for new courses, and somebody presented a course outline that had as a sort of learning objective or outcome, or whatever they call it, analyze how racism affects education. It was something along those lines. And I sent back a note to say, do you mean analyze whether or analyze how? Because that seems to bias the conversation in a particular direction if you say how. And the lecturer concerned sent back to say, no, I mean how.
Oh, of course. Yeah. And I think that, Michael, you're a reasonably robust person, and you were associate dean of education. So, of course, you had institutional power and all this stuff. But, I mean, a lot of people in the contemporary university, I think, wouldn't even write that note back, because I would have been scared, for example, to write a note like that, because I probably would have done it, but I would have had the sense that if they take it to someone higher up, I'm going to be in trouble, because I question whether racism even existed.
Yep.
And that's one of the sacred cows of the university, right? That it's all racist, as we heard last night.
Yep.
Ad nauseum. Okay, so I defend people's right to say that, of course.
Of course.
But it's, that's
and also
that's
people's right to challenge it, and that's
where
where
right,
the problem
exactly.
lies.
That's exactly right. Okay, so I mean, we've talked about bias extensively already, but so let's maybe sort of talk about the event. I mean, I think that the way it was set up was very interesting in itself, right? So originally it was going to be a panel of 5 people, which I would say was sort of 3 to 2 left to right ratio. I mean, we had this conversation before on the Free Kiwis dialogue, and you were saying, don't think of it in terms of left and right, think of it in terms of like classical liberal understanding of free speech, which we would say was like an actual defense of free speech, or the opposite. But I think that whichever way we look at it, this event as it transpired, it had an 8 to 2 ratio, right?
Yes. I mean, I would say on the panel that I spoke on, there were 5 members. I think that 2 of them were extreme activists. 2 of them were perfectly reasonable academics who may not have thought that deeply about free speech and academic freedom.
So that's Richard Arnold and Nicole Moore.
That's right. And I had no problem with the way in which they discussed things, or again, actually discussed is the wrong word, because there was no opportunity for discussion, but the way they phrased their comments, they were thoughtful enough. I didn't agree with all of them. I agreed with some of them. Had it been a proper discussion, I could have had an interesting interchange with them. But I was certainly the only one on that panel with a kind of full-throated defence of academic freedom and free speech. And I would say on the first panel, Jonathan Ayling was the only person.
I think that second bit is more certain, because before this, when we were discussing the event before it actually happened, we were trying to figure out like what side people would be on, or whether the two sides is the way to think about it. And I remember saying in the last episode, John Byron, we don't know much about him. There were whispers that he was going to be kind of pro-free speech, even though I think he's associated with he has worked for the Australian Labor Party. So I sort of put him in the left-wing camp, but I thought maybe he's in favor of free speech. But I think that was sort of I was decisively kind of shown wrong. I was shown to be wrong on that. Like he seemed to have all the tropes of the contemporary sort of anti-free speech movement.
Well, I mean, his style of presentation was embarrassing. He apologising for being male and white and all of that, essentially apologising.
These are grave sins, Michael.
Yeah. I mean, less said the better, really. He was pathetic.
But let's not pile in on him, because he did say he was left-handed, so we have
That's
to
true.
take that into account. I mean, I think that was kind of a joke, but
yeah.
I mean, the rest of it, basically saying that he shouldn't speak because he's white and male, that wasn't a joke. I think that was sincere.
Absolutely sincere.
But I think that, so Richard Arnold and Nicole Morum, I agree with you that on your panel, they were more to the center, or at least they...
Well, they were capable of reasonable discussion.
They're capable of reasonable discussion, but also I think in terms of their substantive views, like what they actually said, Richard Arnold, for example, did say that he talks to people all the time who feel stifled.
Yep.
And he thinks there is a problem with academic freedom.
Yep.
Other than that, I think in a lot of ways he is sort of with the more anti-free speech people. He's talking about how in many cases it's appropriate to have to stifle yourself and things like that. And then Nicole Morum, again, I mean, there were one or two things she said. Like at the beginning, she was saying how there are threats to free speech from the right and the left.
Yeah.
But then I think in the end, she seemed like incredibly skeptical of the idea that there was a problem big enough for some kind of intervention or reform to be necessary. And we'll get into her arguments and other people's arguments later about whether a government taking action to restore the true purpose of universities, which is to have free speech, is an example of government intervention.
Yeah, I think that is,
or an example of or it's an example of governments limiting or overturning university autonomy.
Yeah. So let's park that one, because it is worth discussing in some,
all right. So
some detail.
Anyway, we're still on the sort of bias bit, and I guess I'll just go down what I noted down. I mean, so I turned up to this session, and loads of people there. It wasn't actually absolutely packed, but there was a good number of people there.
Probably 80% full or something.
80% full.
Yeah.
Lots of security guards. And then I get handed... I think someone actually offered to give me this 3 times, right? Because there was people there. And I don't know the relationship between this group and students of VUW or whatever, but they had a large presence. And this is the Poneke anti-fascist, so-called, I should say, anti-fascist coalition. And they printed out this handsome little document, Free Speech and Power, A Guide to Rights and Realities, which I actually read while the first guy was doing the Waiata. And it's really strongly anti-free speech, and it has all these tropes of the contemporary anti-free speech movement, which is really strange, like, because if you're anti-fascism, you'd think that one of the things you'd be against is limitations on free speech and undermining of free speech. But anyway, so that's like part of the context. I'm just saying, like, as someone who went to this event, you get handed this. Maybe that's nothing to do with the organizers, but this happens. That was what happened. And then you sit down, and then the first thing that happens is this guy stands up and does extensive kind of karakia or waiata, I'm not sure which, all in Maori. Both. Yeah. So again, so this is something I don't object to inherently. Like I actually quite interested in it. Tried to learn Maori. I'm still sort of half trying, and I like to be exposed to Pacific or Polynesian languages. I think it's interesting. But just in terms of the university and like whether the universities can reform themselves and whether they even know what neutrality is at this point, it's pretty obvious that in contemporary New Zealand or contemporary Aotearoa, if you say Aotearoa, for example, it's coded as progressive. Right? Most people would see that as more of a progressive thing. So it's the same thing with these Waiata. Like they kind of know, I think, that a lot of classical liberals or conservatives dislike these things, usually in my experience, not because they dislike Maori, but just because they have objections to, they think of Waiata and karakia as religious, and they think it's undermining institutional neutrality. Yeah. So from the get-go, they're kind of doing things to piss off one side, right?
Our friend, Professor Elizabeth Rata, for example, will leave the room when a meeting is commenced with the karakia, because she objects quite reasonably, in my view, that the university should be a secular environment and not meetings should not be started with prayers.
Yeah, so I don't know what the guy was saying because I don't know Maori well enough.
Well, I mean, that's another kind of potential objection. If you're going to do something like that, maybe it should be done in a language that everybody in the room understands rather than just a handful.
Yeah, but I think this is the thing. I sort of see that. I think it's fair to see that as quite a partisan move, right? Because I also think that it's pretty common that any kind of objection to that is then sort of turned against you. And so you must be racist.
It's partisan, but again, it's so de rigueur in universities to start meetings with that most people are completely unreflective on.
Yeah, which I think just
the potential
sort of
problems
goes to show they don't get it. Like if we leave universities to try and clean up their own act and try and become actually, do the job they're supposed to do and become neutral and open to different points of view, they wouldn't even be able to do it with the best will in the world, and I don't think they have the best will in the world, far from it. The other thing is, so the way that this was organized was that originally it was going to be in the hub, a public meeting. Yep. I think it was going to be open to basically anybody. And, the hub during the day, you can pretty much just walk in from the street. Okay, it's up on a hill, but like if you wanted to, you could just go to it as a member of the public.
Yeah.
This one was much more tightly constrained, but I think you had to have some kind of affiliation with the university
to be able to register or invited by one of the speakers.
Or invited by one of the speakers, which is a relatively small number of people, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like a closed shop. And my perception of the crowd was that there were lecturers, academics, and students, and it's like we all know what side they're on, right?
Well, it was fairly clear what the mood of the crowd was. There were actually quite a small number of students. It was mostly academics, I think.
Yeah, I thought a really interesting point in the discussion was near the end when Corin Dan asked you, like, a fair question, I think, but like a tough question of the sort that I didn't hear him put to many of the other speakers, which was, would you host Julian Batchelor on campus?
Yeah.
I don't actually know much about Julian Batchelor. Like, I don't want to slander him either. Like, I looked him up recently because it came up about the postponement to the last debate, because I believe Markale Parkinson, the student leader who wanted to deplatform Jonathan Ayling, one of the reasons she wanted to deplatform Jonathan Ayling was because he had defended the speech rights of this guy, Julian Batchelor.
Yeah.
She claimed on Sean Plunkett's program on the platform that Julian Batchelor had an event at which he excluded Maori. I don't know the truth of this. Maybe that's the case.
I don't either.
But I looked up something. The first article I found, I think it was an RNZ article or stuff, and it had a quotation from. It had people accusing him of excluding Maori from an event, and it had a quotation from Julian Batchelor saying, "I did not do this. I did not exclude people on the basis of race." So that's something we need to note, right? Mm-hmm. But anyway, so they asked you that question about Julian Batchelor, and you said, I think if members of the university community invite someone to speak,
they should be allowed to do so.
Yeah, they should be allowed to do so, and then you went into what I think is a very solid point. It's the kind of point that was, very common back in the day when universities supported free speech. If you go back in time, it's easy nowadays to say this person is both wrong and immoral, so we should shut them up. But if you go back in time, not even that far, like even to the 19th century, Charles Darwin, who we now think of as one of the great scientific geniuses of all time and having made like one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of all time with the theory of evolution by natural selection, he was seen at the time by most respectable people, as beyond the pale because he was denying the truth of Christianity, right?
Most people in the 19th century in England were religious Christians, and many of them saw his views as deeply offensive and an affront to God and all that is right and good. Fortunately for Darwin, he didn't live in Galileo's time when there was an inquisition ready to threaten him with torture for his views, but he certainly faced his share of opprobrium, so much so actually that he delayed publishing The Descent of Man, which was specifically about human evolution, for quite some time.
Yeah. So anyway, the point I was going to raise about that is just that it's a solid point, but then when you said that, you got like quite a lot of, I don't know if I could describe it as barracking, but it was definitely like an audible kind of hubbub from the audience, and in very negative kind of, oh my God. Because I think they were just being, if I had to guess what they were thinking, it sounded like they took you as saying Julian Batchelor might be the next Charles Darwin.
Well, that wasn't what I was saying.
Exactly.
The broader point that I was making is that if we're not prepared to listen to ideas that we think are offensive and strike us from the outset as being probably wrong, then we close the door to the occasional so-called crackpot who has it just right.
Yeah, yeah. No.
And more than that, the other point that I was trying to make during that little interchange was that even if Julian Batchelor is completely wrong about everything, totally offensive, a complete racist, and all the rest of it, there are a lot of people who agree with him and turn up to his meetings and want to hear what he has to say, and that might affect how they vote, and it might affect things about the future of the country. So the best way to deal with that is to confront his views, rather than just say he's beyond the pale and we're not going to even acknowledge his existence.
Yeah.
That leaves him free to promulgate his views unchallenged.
Yeah, there's another point which I might have expected, law professors and people who are the deans of law at New Zealand universities to get, which is also that in the way that liberal democratic societies, constitutional democracies work, is that you have these discussions about these fundamental things, and then they're encoded in law, and there's law that's sort of more fundamental than others. And one of the more fundamental types of law we have involves human rights, and people have a right to free speech. It's in the New Zealand Bill of Rights. It's in the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights. And so it doesn't really matter if you think that person is racist or bad, you disagree with them. They have free speech rights. And it doesn't work in the way that you just think, oh, I hate what they say, so I can violate those rights. That's the reason we have those rights. So I think it was quite disturbing that we didn't hear that raised by some of the legal academics.
Yeah.
All right. So this is all very negative, which I think is justified. But maybe let's try and include some things that we thought that the other panelists said, which we actually agreed with. Because I did find myself sometimes surprised by moments of agreement. I mean, some of the times they kind of let slip things which I think went against what they were saying, and it was involuntary. But sometimes they meant to say things which are probably true, right?
Yeah. Well, as you said, Richard Arnold acknowledged that a lot of students feel inhibited to speak their minds. I think Nicole Moram made a similar point.
Yeah, she was saying that there were threats to free speech. There were threats to free speech from the left, from the far left, especially with lecturers having complaints from students about things they said, so the kind of woke progressive stuff about language. But there were also threats to the right. And actually, this is a good point. Like, I think a lot of the speakers were they were speaking against the idea that there are threats to freedom of speech or academic freedom from the far left. But in doing so, they often made points of this nature. But there are threats from the right. There are threats from managers as well. That's why people feel stifled. And I just sort of sat there thinking, yes, exactly. Like, there are threats to free speech. Like, you're just making our point.
I mean, the managers are not coming from the left or the right. They're coming from being managers and protecting reputations in their minds and so on. So
I think there's a bit of that. I also think some of the managers are woke, and I also think that some of the managers take the woke ideology as like a test of your fealty. And their authority.
All of that's true, but I think Jane Kelsey made a reasonable point about the extent to which managerial culture within universities stifles the academic side.
Yeah.
In the past, academics ran the university from top to bottom, and so the values of academic freedom were flowing through the university from the top to bottom, and anybody could speak up to the Vice-Chancellor and freely did so.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that strongly. University, democratic governments is down, so I enjoyed that bit of what she was saying. And she also said, I mean, you mentioned this already, but the particular things I noted her saying is there are free speech threats from things like upsetting university donors. So, you don't want to say this because they won't give us money.
And the CCP.
And China, and, like a Uyghur speaker. I can't think of any actual case of that, but I mean, there have been things around like Anne-Marie Brady at Canterbury.
Yeah.
And flyers about Hong Kong, people not able to hold events commemorating Tiananmen Square.
Because the universities are captured by Chinese student money.
Chinese student money, or more direct involvement from the CCP through Confucius Institutes or whatever. So that is a threat, and that's something we're actually...
more Australia than New Zealand, but yeah.
Yeah, I think there's maybe some people think there's a bit of that in New Zealand too, but we're going to look at this. We are looking at this. I am actively kind of writing out the section on possible threats to academic freedom in New Zealand from the CCP. So we agree with that. That's great. What other points did we agree with? So I think that Ajahn Rahman, she talked a bit about social media and violence against Rohingya people. So she had some pretty good examples if they cash out, which I'm assuming they do, in terms of the evidence that like there were people in Myanmar, or I think she mentioned other cases too, where, you literally have people on social media arguing, and then someone goes and kills somebody, and they quote what the person said on Facebook, or in that context. I can't remember all the details.
Yeah,
and I think that
she wasn't very coherent in the way she presented.
Yeah, I mean, so she was obviously kind of emotional, but I mean, which maybe is justified in that context. But I mean, yeah, there probably are such cases. I mean, I would sort of want to think about it in a more academic way, like, what do the studies show? I mean, have there been large-scale studies of social media and the level of violence? Because my suspicion is with these things that if you look at the free speech as, things like the printing press came in, and often initially there's more violence, but if you look at these things over the long term, if it's true that social media leads to mass killings and killings and stuff like that, you would expect there to be some kind of a correlation, like violence goes up after we have the internet. In fact, all the evidence seems to suggest that in the past 20 years, as the internet has come in, 20, 30, 40 years, whatever, as the internet has come in, that's happened at the same time as a reduction in violence. I'm not saying that means that social media caused...
There's any causal
relationship. But at least, like, if if the level of violence is going down, it can't be the case that more social media causes more violence, right?
It can be if there's a stronger trend
there's lots
down
from
other things.
Yeah, it's less likely.
I mean, all of those comments seem to me pretty obliquely related to the issue at hand, which is what universities can do to support free speech.
Oh yeah, I mean that's something we'll get onto later as well. That's just like, I find the discussion very frustrating, because in Rahman's speech as well, I mean, it was some people enjoyed it, I think, and thought it was powerful, but she kept saying, would anybody justify going up to Corandan at this talk, putting up their hand and saying, we need to behead him? And the answer is, well, as Jonathan Ailing pointed out, no, because A, that's already illegal because it's incitement to violence, and B, because nobody wants to do that. Nobody in New Zealand has that inclination to say let's behead Corandan, and it's just a distraction from the real issues, right? The real issue is why can't Don Brash, former leader of the National Party, talk about the Treaty of Waitangi at Massey University? Why can't gender-critical feminists discuss things as they tried to at Massey and got deplatformed, as Daphne Whitmore tried to at AUT and got deplatformed?
Why can't a biology professor put his name to a letter saying that it's a bit problematic to have Mataranga Māori in science and then lose his first year teaching?
Yeah, exactly. And there are many more cases that are going to come out in our report. Any more things that we agreed with? There's another point along these lines of them sort of coming up with cases that seem to contradict the idea that there's a left-wing threat to free speech, but was actually kind of grist to our mill, because we believe actually that there is a left-wing threat to free speech, which is by far the greatest threat to academic freedom, but there are also other threats. And so Morgan Godfrey was saying if he polled most Maori students, they probably would feel stifled. And I think that may be true. And we know that because we did the heterodox New Zealand survey of undergraduates, that's the case of a significant number, 30 or 40% of undergraduate students, they feel stifled. So that, again, is sort of grist.
Yeah, and I think it was Jane Kelsey, again, who raised the history of the universities and pointing out that in the past, women, working class students, certainly Māori students, all felt kind of out of place on campus. And I think I've got a lot of sympathy for that view. I think that universities should be accessible to people from all backgrounds. That said, I think they need to maintain an academic standard when they do so. And that does present a puzzle educationally, and one that we need to solve at school level as well as university level, which is how to maintain a high level of disciplinary focus in learning and make that accessible to people whose backgrounds don't give them the advantages that other people have. That's a genuine puzzle and question. And the way to do it is not to remove all the standards and abolish disciplinary learning and just bring everything down to a level that everybody can achieve. It requires a much more difficult task, which is to help those people access the knowledge that universities and I think certainly the senior secondary school ought to be focusing on.
Yeah.
But it's a far harder thing to do, and they don't really seem to be up to doing that.
Yeah, there's another point about that, I think, when she was saying, if you go back to even the 70s, like there were very few women, very few marry, and they felt bad because they were in the minority. Well, I mean, that may be true, but then it's kind of weird to turn around when people are saying to you, oh, but there are very few conservatives and even sort of centrist liberals in academia, and they feel bad because they're in the exiguous minority, to sort of completely dismiss that out of hand, right? Because if it's true that like being in an exiguous minority makes you feel uncomfortable.
I'm certainly not saying she's not a hypocrite. I think she's...
No, I'm not. That's just an extra point. It's not I'm not hitting back at your point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a list of, I've written canards, or, I guess things I disagreed with, let's put it that way, on what the panel said. All right, so one of them is, somebody said, I can't remember who, the people arguing for free speech haven't suffered harm. And, this is the idea that it's all white guys who are privileged talking about free speech, and they actually haven't suffered harm from speech because they're not minorities.
What I find most objectionable about that canard is that they have no bloody idea what people have suffered.
They don't have that lived experience.
Yes, well, I mean, if you're going to make a kind of blanket statement about somebody on the basis of superficial characteristics like their race and sex, you are glossing over their, as you say, their lived experience, their entire, everything else about them. And everybody has suffered harm one way or another. That's part of being alive. It's part of negotiating your way through the world.
Yeah, but they haven't suffered as much harm because there are never statements at the university about white men being worse. Oh shit, there are actually, aren't there?
Yeah.
I was in a seminar once in the classics program with Vic. It was actually a visiting speaker. I hasten to say, because I don't think anyone in the Vic program would say anything like this. But it was about like the Samnites or something. It was like one of these Italic or Latin peoples that the Romans eventually kind of crunched and absorbed. And it was full of all these things like, people in the past misunderstood this period of Roman history because they were cis-het white male. Like, it was all about, they're heterosexual males, and so they misunderstood this thing about the Samnites. And I just remember thinking, what? Like, how is that possibly relevant? I mean, it's possible that like the fact that there was homophobia in the past has led us to misunderstand like Sappho. I think that's true.
Right.
But it's not relevant to the Samnites, right? So anyway, this is just one example. I think there are actually loads of examples.
The Romans had some curious notions about sex, I believe. Well, from our perspective.
And the Greeks especially.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think there are actually lots of examples. If you were level-headed and actually open to evidence of people saying mean things about white people and men at universities. And also, I think I do take issue with the idea that the people advocating for free speech haven't been harmed, because there are loads of examples now of people who have been sacked. Maybe it's not in every case a smoking gun that they've been sacked for their views, although in some cases it's pretty damn clear. But these cases where people sort of will speak out or they'll publish a report or something criticizing the university, and then, oh, look, they've been cut at the next series of cuts. That's mysterious. They've been cut even though they had loads more publications than the other person. And this happens all over the place. New Zealand, Australia, the UK, America. Those people have been harmed. Like, they've had their careers completely destroyed because of this atmosphere, right?
Well, possibly somebody in this conversation may have experienced that.
I couldn't possibly comment. Right. So more canards. All right. So one of them is really interesting to me as a kind of historian of political thought. Back in the 90s, when it was the Christian conservatives who were kind of stuffy and priggish rather than the identitarian left, I heard this line a lot. For every right, there is a corresponding responsibility.
That's right.
I don't know where that comes from. But people used to say that, right? It's like, yes, you can play heavy metal music, but rights come with responsibility. So actually, you shouldn't be able to listen to heavy metal music.
Or you shouldn't do it where other people can hear it or something like that.
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to wear Iron Maiden t-shirts, whatever.
Yeah.
And now it's the same thing, right? And Morgan Godfrey said this actual literal quote, the corollary of every right is responsibility, by which he meant something like, yes, you have the right to free speech, but I can, limit it in various ways.
I thought just the same thing. He could have been a conservative politician in the 1970s saying that.
And is this actually true? Like,
that's an interesting question. I suspect that what it comes down to is a misunderstanding of what rights are.
Yeah.
Because you can say that if you are given a privilege, that comes with a responsibility, and you can say that might be a privilege which nature has afforded you, like you're especially smart. So therefore you have a responsibility to use your intelligence to help others and to make the world a better place. And I think that's a reasonable moral position. The gifts that we've been given, we have a responsibility to use, whether they're earned or not.
Okay, that's kind of like a moral or ethical position.
That's right. That's right.
And it's kind of nice.
And you can take that position, but I don't think that that's the same thing as a right. And this is where I think the whole discussion or the whole understanding of what rights are is deeply wrong or kind of incoherent. So to me, the only coherent way to talk about rights are things that we can do unless some authority actively interferes with us doing it. So free speech is a right because we can do it unless somebody stops us. Freedom of association is a right because, again, we can do it unless somebody stops us. Things like the right to education or housing or whatever other positive good people might say is a right is not a coherent use of that term. It's better to describe that as an entitlement.
Okay, yeah.
Because in that case, you're positing that somebody should be given something, and therefore somebody has to give it to them. Yeah. And that gets into a bit of a quagmire, right? Because who and with what resources?
Sure, yeah. But I mean, I also think, I like this legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin's definition of rights, where he says rights are trumps. So they're kind of like you're playing a card game, and you have these cards, and people play like the offense card or the race card or the woman card or whatever. And then you have this card that says free speech, and it says, it doesn't matter if you're offended as a woman or whatever, I have the right to free speech. I mean, that's actually the legal situation as it's been in the West for a long time, right? Effectively, like there are some laws about hate speech and stuff, but they've effectively been ignored for many decades until recently because they're kind of incompatible with the right to free speech. But basically, when you have a right, it's a trump, like it overrules other kind of ordinary objections you might make to them. And so, like, if you look at other rights, if you think about the Rohingya again, so some group, that ethnic minority that's being persecuted, and, when foreign observers, international observers look at these situations, they often say the Rohingya have a right to life, they have a right to probably free speech, but more importantly, kind of they have the right to go, religious freedom, I suppose, is the most relevant one in this case, right? It would be really weird in that situation to say, of course the Rohingya have a right to life. However, this is balanced by responsibilities. So they have a right to life as long as they're not Muslims, or as long as they do the following. Any conditions on putting any conditions on that would just be absurd.
And that's where it connects to my distinction between rights and entitlements, because it is reasonable to say, if I'm giving you this thing, I expect something in return, that you will behave this way, or that you won't do that. That's a kind of exchange. Whereas the idea of negative rights, as they're called, in other words, you can do what you want as long as you don't impinge on reciprocity, that other people have an equal entitlement or an equal right, I should say, to do the same.
Yeah.
And then you can do what you want, because that's the definition of a right.
And again, like as a matter of fact, like if you look up the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the New Zealand Bill of Rights or the Education Act, where it talks about the rights of students to voice controversial and unpopular opinions, I don't remember there being a clause where it then says, except students also have to exercise these responsibilities in order to get those rights. Like I'll look at it again, but I don't think it says underneath that bit about freedom of speech. But you have to bear in mind that you have to say progressive things, like or anything that Morgan Godfrey might want to put on that, right?
Yeah.
All right. So one of the big canards, I think, let's just say, one of the things that many people said at the panel. So Dr. John Byron from the University of Queensland, I think, he said very clearly, he had a very clear view about how we should think about free speech on campus, academic freedom on campus, and others agreed with him. And this was that there should be an easy test, and this is the test of good faith. So you're allowed to speak on campus if you're showing good faith. What's wrong with that, Michael? That seems reasonable.
Well, who decides what good faith is, for one thing? But I'd come back to what I said before, that even if somebody is acting in demonstrable bad faith, that they're openly lying, that what they're saying is deeply offensive to many people and quite clearly wrong to most, in light of most of the evidence, the best thing to do is to invite them to speak so that you can expose what they think and debunk it. Because
Yeah.
if you don't do that, they'll just go off and continue to persuade the people that would like to be persuaded by that point of view without challenge.
I also think, like, when the way he said it initially, if you have good faith, you can argue whatever you want. It sounds kind of a liberal thing to say, but then it's interesting how he immediately then used it to sort of shut down certain types of speech, because then he said, I've written in my notes, I hope this is accurate, the video's out there somewhere. He said, bad faith arguers are very difficult to host at the contemporary university, because that's not what the universities are for. So immediately it's like, oh, good faith, as long as you have good faith, you can say whatever you want. But if you're bad faith, you can't talk on campus, which is, again, like, incorrect in the law, right? It's not.
Again, you have to give somebody the authority to decide who's in good and bad faith.
Yeah. And again, like, I think this point about the law is interesting, because I'm not actually sure if we did that, if we tried to impose that kind of test at New Zealand universities, whether that would be legal, right? Because it says in the Education Act that students and staff can voice voice controversial or unpopular opinions.
Well, if you read the law as it's stated, then it wouldn't be legal.
Well, I mean, they might say, well, those are external speakers, but, like, often these people are invited by students. So I think, like, a reasonably charitable view of the reading of the law would be that the right of students and academics to voice unpopular opinions includes the right to voice those opinions and discuss them with others that they invite onto campus, right?
That's right. But the fundamental issue is that you can't actually tell whether someone is in bad faith or just wrong.
Yeah, and I think in all these cases when academics put forward these supposedly kind of neutral tests for what speech should be allowed, we've got to remember this issue of deep-seated bias. They're in these bubbles. Yeah. They can't even keep track of, their own biases.
And it came across extremely clearly. I mean, one of the things that really underpinned a lot of what the other panelists were saying was that there is no problem with free speech on campuses, really. I mean, a couple of them, like Nicole and Richard, did acknowledge that there is, but most of the panelists kind of laughed it off as absurd that there's any kind of problem with.
Well, it was like, there's no problem at all except for the damn right wingers.
Yeah.
So, like, well, there is a problem then. Yeah. So the John Byron, just to stick on him for a bit, because he had this good faith stuff, and then if you're trying to be as charitable as possible, you might think, okay, well, that he's trying to use this as like a gender neutral, as a politically neutral test for what kind of speech should be allowed. And then his first example was, so Bettina Arndt, who's this kind of, I don't know, would she still define herself as a feminist? She used to be a sex therapist. I think
that's right. But yeah, I don't know if she'd define herself as a feminist.
Okay, but anyway, he basically said, for example, Bettina Arndt is obviously not arguing in good faith, because she believes that what some students say about an epidemic of sexual assault on campus is overblown. Yeah. So immediately, like, whatever you think about that issue, just look at the form of the argument.
That's right.
He is saying, I think Bettina Arndt should not be allowed to speak because I disagree with her.
And not only that, I know she's wrong.
Exactly. So the whole good faith thing is really just kind of like
which shows bad faith on his part, because he's not prepared to listen to a point of view that he's fixed in his mind as wrong.
So let's deplatform John Byron.
Yeah.
We don't actually want to do that. But I mean, if he used his own...
Yes. Hoist by his own petard or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, I think... So the good Dr. Byron, will stick on him for a bit, because he's also said speech can shut down other speech. This is a separate canard, I think, and it wasn't just him, right? And so it's important to note this idea that speech can shut down other speech, and therefore speech needs to be limited. They're not just referring to shouting down, right? Because that in First Amendment law in the U.S., it's very clear that if you try and make a speech and have a talk, and people actually prevent you from saying it because they're making too much noise and stuff, or whistling or whatever, that is not protected by the First Amendment. So the stuff that happened recently at Victoria University of Wellington, the same institution, where the American diplomat was unable to actually say...
Bonnie Jenkins.
Bonnie Jenkins, exactly, thank you. What she was going to say about the Israel-Palestine conflict, because students and staff at Victoria University of Wellington, I think it was staff, but definitely students, shouted her down. That's not covered.
Correct.
So what do you think of this idea? Speech can shut down other speech?
Well, it depends what you mean. If as you just described, it involves yelling and just drowning them out, then I agree it can and shouldn't be allowed to, because that isn't an exercise in free speech. It's the thug's veto or an exercise of censorship.
Yeah.
But if by that he means that what I say can intimidate you into silence, then unless I have some direct power over you, as in I'm threatening you, then that's actually just too bad. You should have the
well, he spoke
fortitude to
about
respond.
He spoke about humiliation, or he or some other speakers spoke about humiliation and intimidation.
So here I think we need to draw a distinction between free speech as a legally protected right and academic freedom, because I do think that universities can and should set some parameters for the way in which discussions take place. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say on this campus we don't have personal insults, we don't have ad hominem attacks. Now sometimes those things will get violated because people get upset and angry and heated and so a certain amount of that you might call it out, and you probably should, but it's not a sackable offence to get a bit upset or a bit overheated during an academic discussion.
And again, that has to be neutral, right?
It has to be neutral, and that's a reasonable rule to have.
Yeah. So in that case, like if people are saying mean things about if people are abusing people for being white or male, that should be treated in the same way as people being abused for being gay
black or female or whatever. Right? Yeah.
Or sorry, straight, or you get the point. And I don't think that's the case at the moment in universities. So again, it depends what we mean by intimidation, right? If it's sort of physical intimidation, it's one thing. If it's just like speech, and I think that again we have to remember the context of the academic freedom debate in New Zealand is that people have actually been deplatformed for wanting to discuss gender and sex and say that there are only two sexes. And I've seen examples of people arguing that those things in themselves, holding that there are two sexes in species Homo sapiens, is itself kind of humiliating and intimidating to trans people.
Well, even that it denies their existence or seeks to erase them.
Yeah, which is obviously not the case, right? Because you can think that there are two sexes. Well, funnily enough, we have a trans friend who's in the free speech space. And as she points out, she wanted to transition to a female because she thought there were two sexes, and she identified more with one of them. Yeah. Right? It's so a lot of trans people actually think they're...
Yeah, that whole area of discussion is incredibly messy, not least because you're not allowed to talk about it properly. But there's a whole lot of kind of logical problems that could be exposed by a free and open debate. And, one of the points, which was fashionable for a time amongst journalists, I think our own Sean Plunkett asked the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, at the time, what a woman is. And the point of that question is to expose the fact that if you say it's whatever you say it's whatever you think it is, if you identify as one, is that it renders the word semantically empty because it's a completely circular definition. It doesn't mean anything other than what you say it means.
Yeah.
So there's a whole lot of things like that in that debate that one could expose if one was able to talk about it without being sacked or cancelled.
Yeah, okay, so let's just underline this point because I've made it several times already, but I think a lot of people at the event were saying everything at unis is fine, there's no trouble with free speech, even though they were then actually bringing examples of their own that there was a problem with free speech. But what I found disturbing was that they didn't deign to actually look at any evidence. They often seem completely ignorant of all the work that's been done on this space, even though actually Jonathan did a fairly good job summarizing it, right? So there's been the Heterodox Academy Survey of Undergraduates in 2022, Free Speech Union Survey of Academics in 2022, the Free Speech Union Survey of Academics in 2023. There's the Leaks Auckland Law School survey. There's and then there's all these incidents, right? And that's one of the most disturbing things. Don Brash getting deplatformed, Daphne Whitmore getting deplatformed, the gender critical feminist getting deplatformed from Massey. No one mentioned any of that, even though that's actually what we should have been talking about. Mm-hmm. Let's move on. Actually, now there's two more canards I want to do. First one is this whole thing about the surveys. So the 2023 Free Speech Union survey, again, was kind of dismissed, I would say, angrily denounced by people on the panel. So you're a statistician, Michael. What do you think about that?
Well, from a statistical point of view, the surveys had a sample size that was adequate enough to get a reasonably accurate estimate of the population of people from which those surveys sampled. the issue, which some people have drawn attention to, which I think is genuine, is that the response rate was low. It was very low. And because it's very low, that increases the likelihood that the sample is not accurately sampling from the population that you're interested in, but from a biased subset of that population.
Yeah, so perfect. So I agree with that. So basically it's like not the best survey in the world. It has these issues with self-selection. That's one of the reasons why the sample might be biased. It has a kind of not hugely impressive sample and, the number of people in the sample.
It's impressive enough. I mean, one of them had more than 1,000 people, and the standard political polls have about 1,000 people, and that gives you a 95% confidence interval. In other words, you're 95% sure that the true population figure falls within a band of about 5 percentage points.
Yeah. So this is one of the things I found interesting, though, is that you've mentioned both of the Free Speech Union surveys, one in 2022 with a sample of over 1,200, and then the one in 2023 with 452, I think, in the sample. And everyone just focused on that one, right? And so basically the strategy was to say that sample had weaknesses, therefore we have no evidence. This is terrible malpractice with these surveys.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, what about the Heterodox Academy survey, which had 700 in the sample and came to similar conclusions, admittedly with a slightly different population, but, same conclusion in the sense that they found that we were involved in it. We found that lots of undergraduates said that there was a problem with free speech, as well as lots of academics.
Yeah.
Then there was the 2022 free speech survey. And one of the interesting things to me is that they changed the question, the way they asked the question slightly, but basically it was the same survey. And the 2022 survey, which actually no one, I think, is criticizing on methodological grounds, basically concluded that, 25 to between a quarter and a third in most cases, sometimes a bit higher, of academics felt stifled on certain controversial issues.
Yeah.
And with the Treaty of Waitangi especially, it was up to half. It was around half in 2022. Yeah. And then in 2023, they found it was over half. Now, I agree with you that it may be that is unreliable. Maybe it wasn't like 57%. Maybe the true figure in the population was something lower or higher. But to me, it just seems very difficult to believe that the 2023 survey, if they'd had a much higher sample, would have come to substantially different conclusions, right?
Again, it's not the sample, it's the response rate that's the big issue.
Oh, okay. Higher response rate, whatever.
If you'd had a response rate of 70%, you may have got a radically different result.
Yeah, you may have.
But here's the thing. Here's where I'll take off my statistician's hat and put on my psychologist's one. The real issue here is, as you've alluded, they're very selective in the surveys that they want to impeach. So this survey may well have egregious problems, but there are numerous other surveys that reach various conclusions that they like, that they're very happy to ignore or promote. So actually the issue is one of confirmation bias. That is people's tendency to want to confirm their pre-existing views rather than have them challenged.
So the Open Inquiry Twitter account or X account put up these interesting examples recently of there was a study done recently of experiences of Pacifica and Maori students in STEM subjects, and their sample size was 43, and the way that they recruited respondents or participants was through word of mouth and social media.
Yeah,
which obviously has huge questions raises huge questions in terms of bias, sample bias. Small sample.
You can't even tell what the response rate is because you haven't got a clearly defined sampling frame. In other words, you don't. Whereas if you ring up a whole lot of people on the phone or send emails to a bunch of people, then you know how many people you've asked to participate.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're just randomly stopping people in the street or at a event or something like that, you don't have a clear idea of your response rate because you've asked a subset of people who were potentially there to be asked, and you don't know how many they were. And
there was another example of that thread where they studied some kind of Maori experiences in academia, and they went to these Maori cultural events around the country, and they stopped people and interviewed them. And again, it's like they didn't actually note down the number of people that they stopped and asked, so they don't really know the...
And the other thing, that, as I recall, the respondents in that survey were 2 to 1 female.
Yeah, that's right.
And so clearly it wasn't a representative sample.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that when you do things like that, researcher bias in terms of who is being asked comes into it, and that bias can either be overt or subconscious.
Yeah, and also if you're asking people about, their experiences as Maori, there are probably lots of people in this country who are Maori or have some Maori heritage who don't particularly care about race or not that interested in Maori ancestry or whatever, their culture. And there are people who obviously, it's more important to them. And it's pretty obvious to me that there's going to be some effect on how you perceive your experience in academia. So you can't just go to these Maori cultural events where it's obvious that people are going to identify more as Maori who are at those events and pretend that you can do it. It's just that you have to then take that into account and note it down, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's not just the case as well that these academics don't know about these surveys. Because on X recently, I actually asked Richard Easter, who's the Auckland physicist, who's been one of the people who's been most dismissive of the Free Speech Union survey in 2023. And I actually just said to him several times, I want to give you the chance. Here's the survey, N of 43. They recruited through word of mouth. What do you think about that? He declined to criticize it.
Yeah. Which
suggests to me either that he's scared because, if you criticize surveys which come to progressive conclusions in contemporary academia, that can be things can be difficult for you, or that he's genuinely so biased that he can't see that, this
is a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to see how he could be that biased since he's made all of the statistical arguments reasonably clearly himself.
I know, it's kind of astounding. I don't really understand. That's why several times I said, I'm giving you the opportunity to criticize this, and you didn't want to. All right, so last canard. So basically, I think anyone fair-minded watching that has to think, oh my God, we've got a huge problem with academic freedom at the university. Not only is there all this evidence there's a problem with academic freedom, but a lot of the academics themselves are they grossly misunderstand free speech, or they're actively against it. And a lot of them then sort of lined up at the panel and said, the last thing we need is government interference, because having laws helping free speech at universities would represent illegitimate government interference and a violation of university autonomy.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Well, in principle, in a reasonable world, I think it's deeply unfortunate if government interference is required to get universities to do their jobs. But I think things have got so bad that the taxpayers are not getting what they're paying for. The universities are not doing what the Education and Training Act requires them to do, which is to be a neutral venue for the discussion of whatever ideas university members want to discuss. And in the end, they are not fully independent organisations. They're publicly funded, and they have a duty to the people of the country to do the job that they're funded to do, and they're clearly not doing it.
Yeah.
And in that situation, I think it is legitimate for the government to intervene.
Yeah, and it's clearly not a violation of university autonomy, right? Because there's a conflation of university autonomy, which is kind of the freedom of academics to teach what they want and say what they want and, research what they want, which we would defend. And the idea that they can just use this public money for ends which are not the kind of stated ends of the money they're being given.
That's right.
So it's kind of like the government says we're gonna found this sort of lemon farm or something. You have to produce lemons, and you go off and you take the money and you just use it to buy drugs or something. And then the government intervenes. You're like, but you're violating my autonomy. And it's like, no, you might have said you have the right to grow lemons in whatever way you want,
or
but
whatever
still,
varieties of lemons.
Yeah,
and
some
so
of that.
Yeah.
But you have to actually do the job that you're meant to do. And it's a greater thing as well, because actually, what the government would be intervening and doing is actually preventing people from violating others'
and
rights.
That's the logical contradiction in what they're saying. Because if there was no problem with free speech on campus, as they claim, then that legislation wouldn't do anything, because it would just stipulate they had to do what they were already doing.
Exactly. So why do they feel so threatened?
Yeah.
And that's another thing as well, which I find really interesting about this, and the interesting about the New Zealand media as well, that, I've seen a few articles now where they quote academics as saying, all this free speech stuff is horrible and we don't need legislation. Well, it's fine. Of course you need to talk to people and report what they say, but you have to also be aware that there are these vested interests, right? So obviously there are some academics, great numbers of them who feel so intimidated they can't say anything because they're afraid of getting bullied by others, right?
Yeah.
And so obviously there are people on university who are bullying other people, in some cases even making them redundant because of things they've said. And so those people are obviously going to be threatened by being found out, right? Or having that revealed or and being held to account.
Yeah.
So, you've got to just take that with a pinch of salt, I think. So, yeah, I mean, so Nicole Morum described forcing uni. So one thing is that they were talking about was this Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act in the UK, which is coming in August. And it has really strong and I think fully appropriate provisions to actually, help the government, take back the unis and make them what they're supposed to be and make sure there's no malpractice and sort of stop all the bullying. And one of the things they do is they force unis to accept speakers that somebody invites to campus, assuming they're speaking within the law, right? So there's no kind of open libel or incitement to violence and stuff. And
which the New Zealand Education and Training Act also stipulates.
That's right. That's what I was just about to say. So she said, Nicole Morum says this is an extreme thing to think that if people invite someone to campus, they should be allowed to speak as long as they're speaking within the law. She sees that as extreme. But I'm like, you read the Education and Training Act and it already says...
That's what it says.
Well, it says, okay, again, this is like a slightly subtle point, but it's like, it says that students and academics have the right to voice and discuss unpopular or controversial opinions. And I think it's a very fair interpretation to think that that also includes them having sort of politics clubs and stuff, right?
Yep.
So like the Manawatu Politics Club, I think that's what it was called at Massey, who invited Don Brash. And then the Vice Chancellor found out about this. And the emails show that because she didn't like Don Brash's politics, she tried to defund the Politics Club, and also she successfully deplatformed Don Brash. Like that's the kind of thing that's happening that the law, like a law like the law in England, would actually change.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why people see that as extreme. Like that's what the law already sort of says.
Well, they see it as they paint it as extreme because I suspect they're scared that they won't get away with what they're currently getting away with.
Yeah. All right. So I think that we have now gone through all the canards.
I actually have one more canard, which is the safety canard.
Oh, yeah, the safetyism. I did note that down too. Okay, tell me about that.
Well, one thing that came up again and again during the conversation was how everybody needed to feel safe. I'm not sure if it was expressed as a right to feel safe. I think it was at one point, and I think Jonathan Ayling actually pointed out that there's a difference between the right to be safe and the right to feel safe, because those are not the same thing, which is to say, yes, students and staff should be free from intimidation, violence, and other coercive actions on campuses, because otherwise, well, first of all, their physical safety might actually be threatened, and also they would feel rightly reticent to speak their minds if they thought that somebody might beat them up if they said something they didn't like. So let's set that aside. People should, in fact, be safe on campus. But this idea of safety has now been extended into not hearing things that might upset you a little bit. And a case in point was the salient article about the free speech panel when students had complained that Jonathan Ayling was to be included in the first place, and some people thought I shouldn't have been either, and it was going to be held in the hub. And the salient article claimed that students might be harmed by inadvertently walking through the hub and hearing the conversation. And I think I quote from the article, once something has been said, it can never be unsaid. A bit akin to if somebody sticks a knife in your back, then that's going to cause you a permanent injury.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure whether that was in the article or whether it was in the interview, but anyway, it's the same. It's definitely Mark Hale Parkinson, I think, or Henry Broadbent.
I think it was. I think it was Henry Broadbent.
Okay, well, anyway,
I think
someone
it was
definitely
in the article.
One of the students definitely said this. One of the student leaders. And so I think Ajahn Raman said. Ajahn Raman's speech was a lot about how, again, we shouldn't be allowed to incite violence and say that people should be beheaded. And she said at some point, this is not about feelings of hurt, right? And, her examples were not about feelings of hurt. But as you point out, the fact that the panel was postponed was about feelings of hurt.
Yeah.
And feelings of hurt is often what gets these things deplatformed. It often is what violates people's freedom of speech on campus.
One is reminded of Dawn Freshwater, the Vice Chancellor at Auckland University, who said that the Listener 7 caused hurt and dismay.
That's right. So you've taken Dawn Freshwater has taken an institutional position there based on feels.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the speakers, I think it might have been Raman again, was emphasizing that people should feel uncomfortable on campus. And I really was nodding my head at that point. She said something like, universities should make people feel uncomfortable 3 times a week. And I was like, that's great. That's exactly what I think. And then at the end, I noticed it's very telling. She said, universities should be places of discomfort. We should be uncomfortable, but not unsafe. Yeah. And I was like, there it goes. Because it's like, and again, it depends what she means. If she means that you shouldn't have the right to like smack someone in the face or something, obviously you shouldn't be unsafe in that sense. You should be safe from like actual sexual assault or, intimidation of various sorts. But I strongly suspect that what she has in mind is unsafe from
ideas
words
that
she doesn't like.
And actually that was, when we were preparing for this free speech panel, I was offered a chaperone on campus in case I felt unsafe. Yeah. And to be fair, maybe they thought I would fear protesters or somebody getting in my way or whatever. I didn't, and I appreciated the gesture from that perspective. But also there was a kind of, the fact that they felt that they had to hold it in a lecture theatre and not the hub, and there was certainly a sense that the university was trying to protect young people from, or students, or perhaps even staff from hearing things that they might find upsetting or offensive or something like that. Yeah. And of course being upset and offended is part of the territory if you can discuss anything serious. Yeah. So,
and I agree with what Raman was saying at some point. I don't agree with the substantive point, but at one point she started saying, we need to be able to say the university is racist. Everything we do is racist. It's racist in all these different ways. And I agree with her. I defend her right to say that. But I think it just goes to show, again, the vast asymmetries at universities, because all the academics are going to nod their heads that you should be allowed to say that. Are you allowed to say, actually, there are 2 sexes, or I don't think the university is racist? I mean, lots of experiences of people who've tried to say things like that at university. They've gotten in deep trouble. I mean, sometimes on the institutional level. So, there's a lot of safetyism there. And I think Kylie Quinn at some point said, I've noted her as saying, some people on campus, quotation marks, pose a threat to others' well-being. So that's kind of like something that she sort of said in passing, and I just thought, wait, do you actually think, so maybe safety and well-being, but do you actually think that there are people on campus that seriously threaten others' safety and well-being? Like, if so, who are they? Like, why don't you phone the police, right? If they're actually kind of a serious threat to people's safety. But again, I think she means ideas that they don't like. All right, so that's probably all we should do because we've already gone. This is probably a reasonably long episode, 1 hour and 12 minutes, but we've gone through various canards. We've gone through the sort of vast open bias of the event. Some things that we did agree with some of the other panelists.
There is one thing that I'd like to close with, which is to point out that I think that the way that whole thing was set up was always going to fail. If the panel I was on was framed as being an academic conversation, and yet the conversation was the series of statements, because it wasn't a conversation, was completely controlled by a journalist.
Oh yeah, now, we didn't even talk about the moderator.
Even if you think that the best way to have an academic presentation is for all of the speakers to speak fairly much independently without interchange, which I don't. I think if you're going to have a proper academic discussion, the participants need to be able to communicate with one another reasonably freely. A far better person to do it would have been a senior professor, a distinguished professor of, say, politics or classical studies or history or
proper subjects,
philosophy, something like that. Somebody who has a command, at least a reasonable command of the subject matter, who understands what academic discourse looks like. Instead, we had Corin Dan, a journalist who asked very journalistic questions, who was kind of fond of gotcha moments and all of those journalistic tricks. He fairly clearly doesn't understand anything about the issues at hand. He certainly doesn't know what an academic conversation looks like. And the whole thing was actually destined to fail. And the Vice-Chancellor, Nick Smith, ought to have known that in the first place, because how could he possibly have expected somebody like Corin Dan to mediate an academic conversation?
Yeah, so this is another maybe point to end on. Like, it's an open question, like what Nick Smith is doing here. Like, I think you're a bit more charitable towards him than me. Like, does he actually believe in free speech, and does he actually want to try and change this? And was the point of the event to try and change this? Because if the point of the event was trying to change this, like, it was a really weird event to do that. It was like sort of blatantly.
Well, I think in the end his objective was to get out of it intact, as it were.
I think his objective is something like, as I say, there's been this shift from, there's no problem with free speech to like, yes, we have a problem with free speech. And then they define it in this really weird way. Like, I think he's going to try and present this to the powers that be, the government, and say, look, we've got no problem. We're addressing the problem of free speech. We had a really open panel, which was sort of 80% on one side, and that shows that we're fair-minded.
And a biased audience, and a journalist for a moderator who was, probably biased himself, and in any event had no idea how to moderate an academic discussion.
So there's no problem. So I think that anyone who does look at the video, wherever it is, of this event, if you agree that there's no problem, great. If you look at that and think, actually, this shows there's a serious problem, then I'd say, join us and others in this movement for reform of the universities. I mean,
write to Nick Smith and tell him what you thought.
Write to Nick Smith, write to your MP, maybe write to the ACT Party and the National Party and the New Zealand First to say,
David Seymour, I'd love to hear from you, I'm sure.
That thing in your coalition agreement where you said that you will take action and, force universities to have a free speech policy is appropriate, or maybe write to them and say, we need to go even further. And I think, as I say, I found the event deeply depressing, and I was kind of ashamed that I worked at Victoria University. But also in the end, I was sort of hopeful, because I think that by and large, outside of Wellington and outside of Victoria and other universities, Kiwis are pretty clued up, and they're pretty level-headed, and they're pretty fair. And I think that if they look at that, then it's just going to add to the movement for reform and for making our universities, actually fit for purpose again.
I agree. Bring it on.
All right.